Great, thank you very much. Hi there, I'm Alasdair MacLeod. I'm one of the mechanical engineers at the EERA Catapult. I lead up our engineering team out of our Glasgow office. So we've been doing some testing as part of the TotalControl project on our lever mouth turbine. So I'll take you through a bit of that just now. Bit of the background to the testing itself, some historic analysis we had to do to make ourselves comfortable with what we were doing, the actual testing itself, a little bit on the data, and some brief results that are currently in development. So no final results, just a bit of an update on what we've found through this yaw testing so far. So I'll not go too much over the background of TotalControl, but the idea is that modern wind turbines have reached a high level of maturity in terms of control. However, with farms getting bigger, turbines getting bigger, much more functionality and demand should be required of the controllers in a wind farm situation. So one of the key ideas behind TotalControl is to test new control strategies that will help improve performance on a site or plant-wide situation. As part of TotalControl, the EERA Catapult, we have responsibility for undertaking testing at the lever mouth demonstration turbine, which you can see a picture of inset there. A little bit about the turbine, just to put it in context. It's the largest offshore open access research turbine. We use it for research, testing, training, kind of all around research into operational improvement. It's a pretty big turbine, 7 megawatts. You can see the kind of the size of it there. So it's a fairly daunting prospect to test some new control strategies in something this big. I'm not sure that there's been, particularly with the yaw testing going out to these high yaw angles, we were very unsure about how the turbine would react, what we would see in terms of blade loads and stuff. So we did a fair bit of due diligence to make sure that we could keep the asset safe and provide a good set of tests for the TotalControl project. The turbine itself already has collective pitch control, active damping, load control, and blade monitoring. And nearby, we also have an ISD metmast to give us a good understanding of the wind conditions in the area. So what I'm going to talk about is yaw testing, or that's kind of not really that accurate, yaw misalignment. So control of the wake by yawing the turbine out of perfect alignment with the incoming flow. So that picture there just gives you a kind of idea of what's going on. The red line coming in would be your incident flow field, but you can see the nacelle is not pointing directly into that. And due to that, the wake can be steered. So the idea is we can, in a wind farm situation, we can try and use upstream turbines to steer the wake around the downstream turbines to improve overall performance. Yep. Oh, and one thing in there as well for for this control, what we had to do was sort of trick the wind turbine into thinking it wasn't yawed to stop the control system from fixing itself. So I use the term yaw error, which isn't wholly accurate, but it is used because within the controller, the turbine's yaw is corrected by the wind vanes on the nacelle. Those measure yaw error, or how out of line the turbine is. So to implement this controller, we use the offset within the control system to basically trick the wind turbine to think it's pointing directly into the wind. So the idea is we change the yaw error offset by the certain number of degrees we want to move the turbine round. As I said, we were somewhat concerned about the impact this could have on a turbine of this scale. So we did a whole bunch of historic analysis to look at. One of the things I was intrigued about was whether we'd seen high yaw operation before, and in fact we had. The controller can be somewhat loose sometimes in catching up with gusts and stuff, and that's to protect the yaw system. But we saw in the past a good bit of yawed loading, which showed very little change in fatigue, loads or extreme loads. We were particularly worried about increasing fatigue load, increasing chances of stalling blades, and accidental loads causing shutdowns. So the mitigating those, we did a lot of historic analysis, which showed very little evidence of that happening, which was good. And then we also used that historic analysis to set load limits on our testing. So during the testing, we were very closely monitoring the loads, the incident loads we were seeing, the fatigue loads we were seeing, and what was going on with the alarms. So before doing the tests, we had a whole set of load limits that if they were breached, we would shut down the testing. For ultimates, those were set at 25% greater than those observed historically, which was still well within design loads. And for fatigue, it was 20% greater. And again, that was keeping within design loads. And those plots, I've just noticed now the y-axis is degrees, not radians, but they show some of the historic fatigue data that we were doing analysis on. Another problem or another challenge with the testing is we didn't have a live feed of LiDAR data. So on the turbine, there was a LiDAR installed for the testing, but it wasn't installed to support test and control. It was installed for kind of later analysis. So once we've tricked the turbine to think that a yaw error is not a yaw error, we have no recorded yaw error signal, so we don't know if we're actually achieving the yaw error we're chasing. We did have a historic data set with a LiDAR on with some yawed operation. This particular plot here is just a day where we didn't have any operation, but the turbine was seeing quite high yaw error in a relatively low wind speed. So what we did was compare the met mast wind direction to the nacelle orientation from the SCADA system, and this gave us a fairly reliable measure of yaw error. You can see the comparison there with the turbine sensor, this kind of dummy yaw error signal, and the LiDAR data. So that gave us good confidence that during testing we could get a fairly decent idea of the yaw error we were achieving, and then later down the line we could use the LiDAR to give us more confidence in the actual yaw that was achieved. So during testing, we were very controlled in the way we did it to make sure that we could protect the asset but still achieve the outcomes of the project. And so any given day we would have an appointed member from our team, an appointed member from the on-site operators who would. We would work together to set up tests, make sure we had everything in place in terms of safety, in terms of reporting. We were understanding what was going on with the wind using forecasting. And this would then be reviewed during the day. And twice during the day, we would do kind of live analysis to double check all of our loads to make sure we were achieving the occurrence bins we were after, but we weren't exceeding any of the predefined testing limits that we'd set. Inset there is a quick example of the check sheet that we would use during testing on the day. And then to protect the turbine, we were interested in testing from a range of yaw errors from 0 out to kind of plus 20 degrees at a range of wind speeds to ensure a smooth and uninterrupted testing period. We had pre-approved loading conditions or loadings that we could see within each test bin. So then if we were to fill in our bins and not exceed these conditions, we could move on to the next test safely and without having to go back for more approvals to keep everything running smoothly. So I'll talk a little bit about the data. So as I said, we had two sources of data. We had the SCADA data and the METMAS data. As with everything, data is never perfect when you get it straight from the sensors. So we needed to clean, filter, and match up timestamps between those two things. Actually, we were getting pretty clean data from both the SCADA system and the METMAS for the signals we were most interested in there. One example maybe of something that wasn't perfect is within the directional data there from the METMAS, there was quite a lot of noise or spikes on one of the signals, but this was cleaned up with a simple 1D filter. And also with the wind data itself, we needed to smooth out a good bit of the turbulence to get reliable kind of mean wind speeds. So a quick example of some of the wind data in more detail from one of the days of testing, just to show how the yaw error signals and stuff were working. So you can see the top plot there is wind speed from a range of different wind sensors. They all match pretty well. one observation is that the met mast shows somewhat less variation in wind speed signal than the turbine. I suspect that's to do with the turbine anemometers being in the waked flow on the nacelle, whereas the met mast is a bit away, so should be seen a bit smoother flow stream. And then the second plot there is the various yaw misalignment signals that we had. You can see the 3 from the turbine, there's offsets on them, but generally they're not, if you kind of imagine those meaned around 0, they're generally not showing much change. Whereas you can see at about 8 o'clock, we turned on our 10 degrees plus yaw error in our signal, and then we turned it off again at about 2:30. So you can see a very distinct yaw error maintained pretty well there through that signal. And then the bottom one is just a comparison of the nacelle orientation signal and the met mast direction. So you can see generally the spikes in our yaw error would happen as the met mast, as the turbine tried to track changes in wind direction. So what did we find as we went through those testings? A plot here of power against yaw misalignment that's colored based on density of points. Basically, the red line there is rated power. I don't know if it should have been surprising, but it was somewhat surprising to me that we didn't.
Alasdair, I do not want to worry you, but we are a little bit pressed of time. Can I give you just 2 minutes to conclude the presentation?
Yep, I'm right there. I've got, I think, 1 or 2 more slides.
Perfect.
So, yeah, this plot basically shows the power output from the testing at and above rated, and we saw very little change in power, which is great. The next plot shows a bit of loading information. This is instantaneous blade loads, and there's a slight increase. Well, there's 10 to 15% increase at the higher yaw errors of kind of instantaneous loading, and that translates to sort of a bit of increase in fatigue loading, sub 10%, but nothing too drastic, and still well within the design loads. So outcomes from the testing, as they were catapult, it was a really good test on our ability to test kind of complex or out-of-the-box control strategies at a large scale. We found from our historic analysis that even in normal operation, we do sometimes see fairly large yaw errors while still producing without causing alarms or high vibrations or anything, which was quite interesting. We do see increased fatigue loading at larger yaw angles, but not at the expense of power. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Alasdair.